Hi, I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. 9 days ago, I was standing in a kitchen in Philadelphia, and a 4-year-old asked me a question that I could not answer. It was last Sunday, August of 2026, 6 weeks after the wedding. Travis was at training camp in Missouri, and Taylor had flown in for the weekend on her own, which is a thing she does now, which is one of the developments of this year that I still have not entirely gotten over. She had made a cake. Bennett Kelce, Jason and Kylie's third, 4 years old, an entirely serious person, came into that kitchen while it was cooling and stood in front of the counter with her hands behind her back and looked at it for a long moment. And then she turned around and said to me, "Grandma, why does Auntie Tay always make this one?" And I opened my mouth, and nothing came out, because the answer to that question is 2 years long and involves a table in November of 2024 and a woman who cooked for 7 hours and another woman who sat at that table for 2 hours and 20 minutes and did not eat a single bite of any of it. And a phone call my son made at 11:40 at night that I have never told anybody about. I said something to Bennett. I do not remember what. Something about how it is a nice cake, and Auntie Tay likes making it. She accepted this because she is 4 and went to find her sisters. And I stood in that kitchen with my hands on the counter and thought, somebody is going to have to tell her the real answer eventually. So I am going to tell it now, all of it. Because Bennett will be able to look this up someday, and because the internet got hold of a piece of this 2 years ago and turned it into something stupid and cruel, and because I have been sitting on the whole thing ever since. Here is what actually happened. November 2024. A house in Philadelphia. 9 people at a table. Taylor cooked. Not catered. Not arranged. Cooked. Stood in a kitchen for 5 hours and made a meal with her own hands for my son's brother's family, because she wanted to, because she had asked to, because she had a reason that nobody at that table understood at the time. And Kylie Kelce did not eat a bite of it. Not one bite. Not one forkful. She sat at that table for 2 hours and 20 minutes, and she moved food around a plate, and she did not put a single thing in her mouth. I watched it happen. I sat directly across from her, and I watched the whole thing, and I could not do one single thing about it. Now, I know what you are thinking, because I know what the internet thought, and the internet was wrong, and I want to say that clearly before I go one sentence further. Kylie Kelce did nothing wrong that night. Nothing. Not one thing. What happened at that table was not unkindness, and it was not a snub, and it was not a message, and it was not anything that anybody wrote about it afterward. What it was much worse, and much sadder, and much more human than any of that. And nobody figured it out for 4 days. By which point, my son had already done something that I did not know he was capable of. So let me tell you the whole thing, from the beginning, in order. Part 1. Why she asked. But before I get to the phone call, I have to give you January. January 21st, 2024. Buffalo, New York. The Chiefs playing the Bills in the divisional round. That was the first time Kylie Kelce and Taylor Swift were ever in the same place. I want to say that out loud and let it sit, because people found it strange at the time and wrote about it being strange. Taylor and Travis had been public since September of 2023, 4 months, and Kylie had not met her. The internet decided this meant something. It always does. There were pieces about it. Why haven't they met? Are they avoiding each other? Is there tension? Kylie addressed it eventually, in the flat way Kylie addresses things. She pointed out that she did not meet Travis for nearly a year after she and Jason started dating. She pointed out that people are busy. She said, more or less, this is a made-up story about nothing. She was right, and nobody listened, which is the standard outcome. Here is what I remember about Buffalo. It was cold, in the way that only Buffalo in January is cold, which is a wet cold that comes off the lake and gets into the seams of your clothing. There was snow. There was that specific Bills fan energy, which I have enormous respect for and which is also genuinely frightening. Kylie had a plan for that day. I know because she told me the plan. The plan was, be normal, be brief, do not make it weird. She had also given Jason a very clear instruction, which was, behave. I want you to picture Kylie Kelce, weeks away from finding out she was pregnant again, standing in a snowy parking lot in Buffalo, telling her enormous husband that they were going to meet Taylor Swift today, and could he please, for one afternoon, be a person. Jason took his shirt off in the stands in 18-degree weather and got carried around by Bills fans. You have seen the video. Everyone has seen the video. Kylie told me afterward, on the phone, in a voice of pure exhausted acceptance, I asked for one thing. And I said, what did Taylor think? And Kylie said, and this is the part that matters, this is why I am telling you about Buffalo at all. Kylie said, she thought it was great. She was laughing harder than anybody. She said, that's the best thing I've ever seen. And then Kylie said, and I thought, oh, okay, she's actually fine. I said, so it went well? And Kylie said, it went great. And I said, so what's the problem? And there was a pause on that phone call, a real one. And Kylie said, there's no problem, she's lovely. And then she said, I just have no idea what to do with her. That was January 2024. That is where it started. Not with dislike. With a woman standing in a snowy parking lot in Buffalo, genuinely liking somebody and having no idea what the next step was supposed to look like. They were photographed together that day. There is a picture. Somebody at the game took it and posted it, and it went around. Two women standing next to each other, smiling, perfectly pleasant. And nothing happened for 10 months. I want to jump forward for a second, because something happened last month that belongs right here, July 2026. About 3 weeks after the wedding, Taylor called me from somewhere. I do not know where. She moves constantly. I have stopped asking. And in the middle of an ordinary conversation, she said, do you remember Buffalo? I said, I remember Jason with his shirt off in 18 degrees. She laughed. And then she said, I've thought about that day a lot recently. I said, why? And she said, because I met my sister-in-law that day, and it took me 2 more years to actually meet her. She said, I had a whole plan for that afternoon. I was going to be easy, low-key, not too much. She said, and I executed the plan perfectly, and it accomplished absolutely nothing, because being not too much is the same thing as being nobody. Then she said something that I have written down. She said, Donna, I have spent 20 years being careful with people, and it has cost me more relationships than being reckless ever would have. I said, you're 36. She said, I know. I said, you've got time to be reckless. And Taylor Swift said, I'm working on it. Ask my husband. He says I'm getting worse every month. She said it like it was the best compliment she had ever received. Back to 2024. It started with a phone call in October 2024. Taylor called me. This was still relatively new at that point. She had started calling me directly sometime in the middle of that year, not through Travis, just calling. The way you call somebody you have decided is in your life. She said, can I ask you something that might be strange? I said, those are my favorite kind. She said, does Kylie like me? I want you to sit with that question. I want you to sit with the fact that in October of 2024, Taylor Swift, 34 years old, the most successful musician alive, a woman who had at that point been photographed with essentially every famous person on earth, called her boyfriend's mother to ask whether her boyfriend's brother's wife liked her. I said, of course she does. And Taylor said, okay. And there was a pause that told me, okay meant no. I said, what's going on? She said, nothing's going on. Everything's fine. She's been lovely to me every single time. I said, but. She said, "But I don't know her." She said, "I know Jason. Jason is easy. Jason talks. Jason is loud. Jason tells you things. I know your family. I know Travis, obviously. I feel like I know you," she said. "And I have met Kylie probably 9 times, and I could not tell you one thing about her that I did not read somewhere." I said, "Kylie's private." Taylor said, "I know. That's why I like her." Then she said the thing that made me understand what the call was actually about. She said, "Donna, everybody in the world wants to know me. And she doesn't. And that means if she ever does, it'll actually mean something." I sat down. She said, "I don't want to be Travis's girlfriend at Christmas for the next 30 years. I want to be someone Kylie calls when something happens." I said, "So call her." And Taylor said, "I can't just call her. That's, no, that's an event. That becomes a thing. If I call Kylie Kelce out of nowhere, she has to decide what it means. And then she has to tell Jason about it. And then it's a whole situation." She said, "I need to do something that isn't an event." And that is how the dinner happened. The idea was hers and it was simple. She would cook. Not for a holiday, not for an occasion, just a Tuesday. Come over, or rather, let me come to your house, and I will make food, and we will eat it, and that will be the whole thing. She proposed it to Kylie through Travis, which was probably a mistake and which I did not think of at the time. Travis said something to Jason, Jason said something to Kylie, Kylie said sure. I got invited because Taylor asked me to come. She said, "I want you there." I said, "Why?" And she said, very honestly, "Because if it goes badly, I want somebody at that table who is on my side." I told her it was not going to go badly. I want it on the record that I said that, and that I was wrong. Part 2, The Cooking, November 2024, a Tuesday, Philadelphia. I got there in the early afternoon, and Taylor was already in that kitchen. She had been there since 10 in the morning. I want to describe what I walked into, because it matters. There were bags everywhere. She had brought her own things, not because she was being difficult, but because she had looked up recipes and gone shopping, and there were specific items involved. She had a printout. An actual paper printout, with handwriting in the margins. She had flour on her forearm. I said, "How long have you been here?" She said, "Since 10. I said, "Taylor, it's 1:30. She said, "I know, I'm behind." She was making 4 things. I am not going to list all of them, but the centerpiece was a braise, something that goes in the oven for a long time and comes out in one dish, the kind of food that is designed to be put in the middle of a table and shared. There was bread she had started the night before. There was a thing with roasted vegetables that she kept tasting and adjusting. And there was a dessert. The dessert was the part. I did not know it was the part until much later. She was making a specific cake. And at some point in the afternoon I asked her about it. I said, "That's a lot of work, why that one?" And she said something offhand that I filed away and did not think about again for 4 days. She said, "It's a Delaware thing." I said, "What?" She said, "Kylie's from Delaware. I looked up what people make there. This is apparently a thing." I stood in that kitchen and watched a woman who has performed for 100,000 people at a time, carefully constructing a regional dessert from the state where her boyfriend's brother's wife grew up. Because she wanted somebody who did not need her to like her. We were alone in that kitchen for about 2.5 hours before anybody else got home, and I want to give you some of it, because it is the only long conversation I have ever had with Taylor Swift where she was doing something with her hands the entire time. People talk differently when their hands are busy. I have known that my whole life. It is why my mother and I had every important conversation we ever had over a sink. I asked her when she had learned to cook. She said, "I didn't, really. I learned to bake. Baking I've done forever. Cooking I started about 4 years ago." I said, "Why 4 years ago?" And she said, "Because I was home." She did not elaborate and I did not push, but I understood. There was a period, everybody had one, where the world stopped and everybody was in their house. And Taylor Swift, who had spent her entire adult life in motion, was suddenly in a house with nowhere to be. She said, I got very into it for a while. It was the first thing in about 15 years that I did where nobody was going to see the result. She said, you make a thing and then it's gone. Somebody eats it and it's over. There's no version of it that exists afterward. Nobody reviews it. She stopped stirring for a second. She said, I cannot tell you how much I needed something like that. I want to point at that, because I think it is the key to the entire evening that followed, and I did not understand it at the time. Taylor Swift did not cook that dinner, because cooking is a nice thing to do for people. She cooked it because cooking is the one thing she does that cannot be turned into content. There is no recording of it. It does not go on a chart. It exists for 2 hours in a room, and then it is inside people and gone. It was the most private thing she had to offer. She was offering Kylie the most private thing she had. Around 3, she asked me about Kylie's mother. Not in a nosy way. She asked what Kylie's family was like, and I told her what I know, which is that Kylie's people are Delaware people, unpretentious, athletic, straightforward. That her mother is a woman I have met perhaps 6 times and liked immediately every time. That Kylie was one of 3 girls. Taylor listened to all of it with real attention. Then she said, is her mom close with her? I said, very. And Taylor said, good. And then she said something quiet that I have thought about since. She said, I always want to know if somebody's mother is close with them. It tells you what they're expecting from other people. I said, what do you mean? She said, if somebody grew up with a mother who showed up, they expect people to show up. If they didn't, they don't. And you can be as kind as you want to a person who doesn't expect it, but it takes a very long time to land, because they're waiting for the other thing. She said, it's not about being nice. It's about how long you're willing to keep being nice before it registers. I stood in that kitchen with a dish towel in my hands. I said, how long are you willing? And Taylor Swift said, with this family? Forever. I have nothing else I need. At around 3:30, she got quiet and worked without talking for a while, and then out of nowhere she said, can I ask you something about Travis? I said, yes. She said, does he know how much he does? I said, what do you mean? She said, he does this thing. When something is uncomfortable, he just walks into the middle of it. He doesn't strategize about it. He doesn't wait for a good moment. He just goes. She said, I've never met anybody who does that. I said, he's been like that since he was small. He's not brave about it. He genuinely does not perceive the danger. And she laughed. And then she said, I've spent my whole life around people who perceive the danger. She said, everyone I know is extremely good at reading a room, including me, especially me. It's a survival skill, and we're all excellent at it, and the result is that nobody ever says anything directly to anybody. She said, and then there's Travis. She was quiet for a second. She said, he asked me on our 3rd date if I was happy, not in a small talk way. He put down his fork and asked me if I was happy. She said, nobody had asked me that in about 6 years. I did not say anything. She said, I didn't have an answer. I actually didn't know. I had to go home and think about it for 2 days. I said, what did you decide? And Taylor said, I decided that if a man asks you whether you're happy, and you need 48 hours to work out the answer, you should probably keep seeing that man. Jason came home around 4 and immediately made everything better and worse, which is Jason's gift. He came into the kitchen enormous and loud and delighted, said something that made Taylor laugh, ate something he was not supposed to eat yet, got yelled at, ate another one. Travis got in around 5. He had flown in that morning from somewhere. I want to describe what he did when he walked into that kitchen, because I did not think about it much at the time, and I have thought about it constantly since. He did not go to Taylor first. He came in, said hello to everybody, hugged me, said something to Jason, and then he went and stood next to Taylor at the counter. Not in front of her, next to her, shoulder to shoulder, facing the same direction, and he said something quiet. She said something back without looking up from what she was doing. He nodded, and then he picked up a towel and started drying dishes. That is it. That is the whole interaction. He came into a kitchen where his girlfriend had been working for 7 hours, and he did not make it about the two of them. He did not perform affection. He did not announce himself. He stood next to her and started drying dishes. Later, much later, when all of this was over, I asked him what he had said to her in that moment. He said, I asked if she was okay. I said, what did she say? He said, she said, I'm nervous. And I said, what did you say? And Travis said, nothing. What was I gonna say? She was nervous. She had a right to be. Part 3. The table. 9 of us sat down at around 6:30. Taylor, Travis, Jason, Kylie, me, Wyatt, who was 4, Elliot, who was 3, Bennett, who was 2 and was in a high chair. Kylie was 7 months pregnant with Finley. I want to describe the first 10 minutes because they were good. They were genuinely good. Taylor brought the braise to the table in the dish and put it in the middle, and Jason made a noise, and Wyatt asked what it was, and Taylor explained it to Wyatt in a way that a 4-year-old could follow, and Wyatt said, okay, with enormous seriousness, and held out her plate. Everybody ate. It was extremely good food. Jason said so about 4 times. And I was sitting across from Kylie, and around minute 12 I noticed. She had not eaten anything. She had food on her plate. She had taken a normal portion. She had thanked Taylor. She had participated in every part of the ritual of a person eating dinner. But nothing had gone in her mouth. I noticed it, and I did the thing you do, which is assume you are wrong, and I stopped watching. Around minute 25 I looked again. Still nothing. She had rearranged. She had cut things. There was a piece of bread that had been broken in half and moved. The braise had been pushed toward one side of the plate in a way that made the plate look worked on. Nothing had gone in her mouth, and I looked up at her face. Kylie Kelce is not a woman who is easy to read. She has a very flat, very self-possessed way of being in a room. It is one of the things I love about her, and it is one of the things that makes her hard. But I have known her for 11 years at that point. She was gray. Not pale. Gray. Under the color she normally is, there was a gray, and she was holding her jaw in a specific way, and every 4 or 5 minutes she took a very small controlled breath through her nose. I understood about half of what I was looking at. And then I looked at Taylor. Taylor had also noticed. I could see it. She was doing the thing where you talk to somebody else with total apparent attention while every part of you is aimed somewhere different. She was talking to Jason about something, and she was not with Jason at all. She was tracking a plate 18 inches to her left. And her face was doing the thing that a face does when a person is telling themselves it is fine. Minute 40. Still nothing. Wyatt asked for more. Taylor served her. Wyatt said thank you, and asked whether Taylor could make it again sometime. Taylor said she would make it whenever Wyatt wanted. Jason had thirds. Kylie put her hand flat on the table twice, briefly, in the way you do when you are steadying something. And then Taylor brought out the cake. I want you to understand the shape of what happened next, because it is the part I have never gotten out of my head. She carried it in. She had done something to the top of it. It was decorated, plainly but carefully, in a way that had clearly taken real time. She set it down, and she said, I made this one on purpose. And Kylie looked up at it, and I watched Kylie Kelce's face register something, and then close. She recognized it. That is what happened. In the half second before Kylie's face went back to neutral, I watched her recognize a cake from her childhood on a table in her own dining room and understand, instantly, what it meant that it was there. And then she said, "Taylor, that's beautiful." And she did not eat any of it. She could not. She cut a slice, she put it on a plate, she picked up a fork, and she set the fork back down and said, very lightly, in a completely normal voice, "I'm going to save this for later. I'm so full." And Taylor said, "Of course." And that was the end of the dinner. Ho! Before I tell you about the car, I have to tell you what Travis said to me about that dinner 2 weeks ago. August 2026. He called me from St. Joseph, Missouri, after a practice, in the specific exhausted good mood he gets into in the middle of camp. We were talking about nothing, and then he said, "Hey, is she going to Philly this weekend?" I said, "She said she was." He said, "Good. Tell Kylie to actually eat this time." And he laughed. And I said, "Travis, that is not funny." And he said, "Mom, it's extremely funny. It's the funniest thing that has ever happened in this family. Kylie thinks it's funny. Taylor thinks it's funny. You're the only one who won't let it be funny." And I said, I sat there and watched it happen and did nothing. And there was a pause. And my son said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "That's why it's not funny to you." And then he said, more gently, "Mom, that was 2 years ago. Everybody involved is fine. They're better than fine. They talk more than you and I do." He said, "You're the only one still sitting at that table." I did not have an answer for him. I still do not, entirely. But he is right that everybody else got up, and he is right about why I have not. And I am telling this story partly because a 4-year-old asked me a question in a kitchen last Sunday, and partly because I would like to finally get up from that table. Part 4. The Drive. I left about 40 minutes after that. Travis and Taylor left at the same time. I rode with them because my rental was at their hotel. The car was quiet. Travis was driving. Taylor was in the passenger seat, looking out the window. About 6 minutes in, Taylor said, "That was fine, right?" Travis said, "That was great." She said, "She didn't eat." And Travis said, "I know." And Taylor said, "Okay." And nobody said anything else for maybe 2 minutes. Then Taylor said, and her voice was completely level, which is how I knew. She said, "It was too much, wasn't it?" Travis said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The cake. The Delaware thing. It was too much." I came into her house and cooked at her for 7 hours and made a cake from her childhood, and it was too much, and she felt cornered. She said, "I made it an event. I did exactly the thing I said I wasn't going to do. And I sat in the back seat of that car and did not say anything because it was not mine." Travis pulled the car over. I want to be specific about that. He was driving on a road in Philadelphia at 9 o'clock at night, and he pulled the car over to the side and put it in park. He turned in his seat and looked at her. And he said, "No." She said, "Travis." He said, "No, listen to me." And then my son said something that I have thought about probably 1,000 times since, and that changed what I understood about the two of them permanently. He said, "You don't get to decide what it meant by yourself." He said, "You've been in that seat for 20 years. Something goes sideways, and you're already 3 moves ahead deciding what you did wrong, and you do it so fast that nobody even gets a chance to tell you." He said, "I know why you do it. You do it because for 20 years there was nobody in the car." He said, "There's somebody in the car now." And she did not say anything. He said, "I don't know why she didn't eat. Neither do you. And we are not going to sit here and build a whole story out of a thing we don't know yet." He said, "I'm going to find out. Tonight. And then we'll know." And Taylor Swift sat in the passenger seat of a car on the side of a road in Philadelphia and put both hands over her face. and Travis put his hand on the back of her neck and did not say anything else. We sat there for a while, and then he pulled back onto the road and took me to my hotel, and neither of them said much for the rest of the drive. Part 5. What he did. Travis called Jason that night. He told me about it later. He said he called Jason from the hotel at about 11:15, and he did not ask what he wanted to ask, because Travis is not stupid, and he knew he could not call his brother and say, "Why didn't your wife eat?" So he said, "Hey, is Kylie all right?" And Jason said, "What do you mean?" And Travis said, "I don't know." She looked off. And Jason said, "She's 7 months pregnant, man." And Travis said, "Yeah, but, okay." Yeah. And that was the end of that conversation, and Travis hung up and had learned nothing. Here is what he did next. He did not go back to Taylor and tell her the call was useless. He did not shrug and let it be one of those things. He did not decide, as most people would have decided, that it was a small thing and would blow over. He called Kylie directly. At 11:40 at night, his brother's wife, 7 months pregnant, who he does not call. She picked up. She said, "Is everything okay?" And Travis said, "Yeah, everything's fine. I just wanted to ask you something, and I want you to know that I'm not upset, and this isn't a thing." He said, "Are you okay?" And there was a long pause on the other end of that phone. And Kylie Kelce said, "I have hyperemesis." Part 6. What nobody knew. I am going to explain what that means for anybody who does not know, because I did not fully know either, and because it is the entire hinge of this story. Hyperemesis gravidarum is not morning sickness. It is what happens when pregnancy nausea goes past the ordinary, into the medical. Women are hospitalized for it. They lose weight during pregnancy instead of gaining it. They are given IV fluids. It can last the entire 9 months. Kylie had it with Finley. She had had a version of it before, and it had been worse this time, and she had told almost nobody, because she is Kylie, because she does not want a conversation about herself, because she had 3 small children and a household, and she had decided to just get through it. She had spent that entire dinner nauseated, to the point where putting food in her mouth was not a decision she was capable of making. 2 hours and 20 minutes at that table. 7 months pregnant, sick enough to be gray, not saying one word about it. And she told Travis, "I didn't want to say anything because she cooked all day." She said, "If I'd said something at the beginning, it would have been about me." She worked for 7 hours. "I wasn't going to walk into that room and make it about my stomach." She said, "I figured I'd get through dinner and nobody would notice." And Travis said, "Taylor noticed." And Kylie said, "Oh no." And Travis said, "Yeah." And Kylie Kelce said, and this is verbatim, this is exactly what Travis reported to me, and I have never forgotten the phrasing. She said, "Travis, I need you to give me her number." He said, "You have her number." She said, "No, I don't. I have the number Jason has. I've never used it. It feels like a thing." And Travis said, "It's not a thing." And she said, "Everything is a thing with her, Travis. That's not her fault, but it's true. And I have been trying for a year to figure out how to be normal with somebody who has to have a whole security team to come to my house for dinner." And there it was. That was the actual situation. That was what had been happening for a year. 2 women, both of them private, both of them careful, both of them constitutionally incapable of imposing on anybody, each one convinced that the other one did not particularly want to know her. Kylie thought she could not call, because it would be an event. Taylor thought she could not call, because it would be an event. They were the same person about this, and neither of them knew it. Part 6.5. What Kylie was actually doing. I need to give you Kylie's version of those 2 hours and 20 minutes, because I finally got it from her this summer. In June of 2026, 3 weeks before the wedding, in her kitchen in Philadelphia, on an afternoon when the children were all somewhere else, and the house was quiet for the first time in about 6 years. She told me the whole thing that afternoon, and I want to put it down. She said she had woken up that Tuesday knowing it was going to be a bad day. She said you learn to tell. There is a particular quality to the first 10 minutes of the morning that tells you what kind of day your body has decided on. She said she considered canceling. She said she got as far as picking up her phone. And then she thought about the fact that Taylor was already driving, or flying, or whatever the arrangement was, and that there was a whole apparatus involved in getting that woman to a house in Philadelphia, and that canceling 4 hours out was not canceling a dinner, it was canceling an operation. She said, I couldn't do it. There were people whose whole day was already in motion. So she got up. And she said the thing that got me, which is that she spent the afternoon cleaning her house. 7 months pregnant. Sick enough that she could not eat. 3 small children in the house. And she spent 4 hours cleaning, because Taylor Swift was coming over and she was not going to have the house be less than it should be. I said, Kylie. And she said, don't. And I said, you were sick. And she said, Donna, she was cooking. She had been cooking since 10 in the morning. What was I going to do, sit down? 2 women, one of them cooking for 7 hours because she wanted to be let in. The other one cleaning for 4 hours because she wanted the room to be worthy of the person coming into it. Neither of them saying a word to the other about it. Kylie told me that when Taylor arrived and started unloading bags in her kitchen, she stood in the doorway and had a moment of something close to despair. She said, I realized about 4 minutes in that this was going to be an enormous meal, and I did the math on how long that was going to take to eat. She said, and I thought, I am going to have to sit at a table for 2 hours. She said she made a decision right then and there. The decision was, get through it, do not mention it, and do not under any circumstances let it become the story of the evening. And she executed that decision for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I asked her about the specific mechanics. I said, how did you do it? And she said, matter-of-factly, the way she says everything, I cut things up. If you cut things into small pieces and move them around, most people don't track whether you're eating. You put your fork down between every non-bite. You take a drink when somebody looks at you. You ask a lot of questions, because if you're the one asking, nobody's watching your plate. I said, that's very sophisticated. And Kylie said, I've been pregnant 4 times, Donna. I've gotten through a lot of dinners. And then she said, it worked on everybody except 2 people. I said, who? She said, you. And I said, and? And Kylie Kelce said, and her. She said, I clocked it about halfway through. I could feel her tracking, and I remember thinking, of course she noticed. Of course the one person at this table I was trying to protect is the one person who spent her entire life reading rooms for a living. She said, I was going to say something, right at the end. I got about 2 seconds from it. I said, what stopped you? And she said, she brought out the cake. She said, she brought out that cake and said, I made this one on purpose, and I saw what it was, and I understood that she had looked up where I was from. She said, and if I had told her the truth right at that moment, in front of everyone, right after that, it would have looked like I was making an excuse for not eating her cake. She said, there was no version of saying it that didn't ruin it. So she said the thing about being full. And she saved it. And she went upstairs about 40 minutes after everybody left and was sick for 3 days. I asked her one more thing that afternoon in June. I said, when Travis called you at 11:40 at night, what did you think? And Kylie was quiet for a second. Then she said, I thought, oh no, he knows. And then she said, and then about half a second later I thought, thank God he knows. She said, because I was never going to be able to fix it myself. I'd made it impossible. I'd cornered myself. She said, and then this idiot calls me at 1:45 and just asks. She said, Donna, Do you have any idea how rare that is? I said, I have some idea. And she said, No, I mean it. Think about your own life. Think about all the things that went wrong between people you know and stayed wrong. How many of those would have survived one person picking up a phone and asking a direct question? I thought about it. She said, All of them. And she was right. All of them. Part 7. 4 days. Kylie did not call that night. She called 4 days later. I asked her about the 4 days once, years later, and she said, I threw up for 3 of them, and on the 4th one I could stand up. She called Taylor on a Saturday. I do not know most of what was said in that phone call. Neither of them has told me, and I have not asked, and I would not print it if I knew. But I know 2 things about it, because both of them told me the same 2 things independently, which is how I know they are true. The first is that Kylie opened the call by saying, I ate the cake. She had. 4 days later, when she could keep food down, she had gotten the cake out of the refrigerator at some point in the afternoon and had a piece. And she told Taylor, It's the right one. Whoever told you which one to make, they told you right. And Taylor said, I looked it up. And Kylie said, You looked it up? And Taylor said, I couldn't ask anybody without it getting back to you. The second thing I know is how the call ended. Kylie said, I'm going to say a thing, and then I'm going to hang up, because I don't do this well. And she said, You don't have to audition. You're in. You've been in. I'm sorry I made you think there was a door. And then she hung up. Taylor told me about that phone call 2 days later. She called me, and she got about 4 sentences in, and then had to stop for a second. She said, Donna. She said, I don't have to audition. I said, I know. She said, I've been auditioning my whole life. Part 8. The part the internet got. Now I have to talk about the part that went public, because it did, and because it was covered stupidly, and I have carried a certain amount of anger about it. At some point, months later, Kylie mentioned in some context, an interview, a podcast, I do not remember which, something about Taylor having cooked, and about her not having eaten it. She said it in about 11 words. She said it lightly. She did not explain, because explaining would have meant discussing her own pregnancy sickness in public, which she was never going to do, because that is Kylie. And the internet took those 11 words and did what the internet does. For about a week there were stories. Tension between Kylie and Taylor. Kylie snubbing Taylor. The friendship that is not really a friendship. Somebody wrote about body language in a photograph from a completely different month. Kylie did not respond. Taylor did not respond. Jason did not respond, and Jason responds to everything, which should have told anybody paying attention that there was a reason. And I sat in my house in Cleveland and read about a night I had been at, being described by people who had not been at it, in a way that was wrong in every particular. I called Kylie. I said, Do you want me to say something? And Kylie said, About what? I said, About the dinner. I could clear it up in one sentence. And Kylie said, Donna, don't you dare. She said, If you clear it up, you have to say why. And I'm not putting my pregnancy on the internet so that some people who write about body language can feel better about a Tuesday in November. I said, They're saying you were rude to her. And Kylie said, Taylor knows I wasn't rude to her. That's the only person whose opinion is relevant. That's the only person whose opinion is relevant. I have thought about that sentence a great deal. I said something about it earlier in another story, about how you should watch what people do when nobody is watching. This is the other half of that. This is, watch what people are willing to be misunderstood about. Kylie Kelce took a week of being called cold in public rather than discuss her own health. Taylor Swift, who could have ended it with one sentence in any of 100 venues, said nothing, because saying anything would have required explaining Kylie's private medical business. 2 women who had spent a year unable to figure out how to be friends with each other went silent together to protect each other from strangers. That was the week they actually became sisters. Not the wedding. That week. Part 9. What Travis Did About It. I want to come back to my son, because this is a story about him and Taylor even though he is not in most of it. Travis was furious. I want to describe the specific quality of it, because it surprised me. Travis Kelce is a loud man who feels things loudly and generally in public. When Travis is angry, you know about it. He was not loud about this. He called me during that week, and his voice was completely flat, and I did not like it at all. He said, "They're saying Kylie was rude to her." I said, "I know." He said, "Kylie was throwing up." I said, "I know, Travis." He said, "My sister-in-law spent 2.5 hours at a table sick as a dog because she didn't want to ruin a dinner somebody made, and my wife—" He stopped. He had said wife. They were not married. They were not engaged. It was November of 2024, and he said wife and did not notice. I did not point it out. He said, "And Taylor sat there watching somebody not eat her food and blamed herself for it for 4 days. And now there's a bunch of people writing about a fight that never happened." He said, "And neither of them will let me say anything." I said, "No, they won't." And he said, "I know why. I get it. I just—" And then he said the thing. He said, "I've spent my whole life being able to fix things by being loud. That's my whole toolkit. And I've got two people I love, and the correct thing to do is nothing, and I don't know how to do nothing." I said, "You're doing it." He said, "I hate it." I said, "I know. Do it anyway." And he did. He never said a word publicly about that dinner. Not once. In 2 years. Through everything. He has been asked about Kylie and Taylor probably 40 times since. He has never gone near it. That is the least Travis Kelce thing I have ever seen a person do. And he did it because two women he loves asked him to. Part 9.5. Jason. Jason did not know. I want to say that plainly because it is the part of this story that took me longest to make peace with. Jason Kelce, who was in that house, who was married to that woman, who had been through 3 pregnancies with her already, Jason did not know how sick she was that night. He knew she had hyperemesis. He knew it in the general sense, the way you know a fact about your spouse's condition. What he did not know was that on that particular Tuesday she was at the bottom of it, that she had cleaned the house for 4 hours anyway, that she had sat at a table for 2 hours and 20 minutes without eating. He had thirds. He sat next to her and had 3 helpings and did not notice that his wife had not had one. He found out from Travis. 2 days after the dinner, Travis called him and told him the whole thing, because Travis is not built to hold information, and because he had decided Jason needed to know. I got a call from Jason that night. I have known Jason Kelce for 38 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I have heard him sound like he sounded on that phone call. He said, "Mom, I had thirds." I said, "Jason." He said, "I sat next to her. I sat right next to her for 2 hours, and I had 3 plates of food, and I did not notice that my pregnant wife was not eating." I said, "She was hiding it. She's good at it." And he said, "That's worse." He said, "That's worse, Mom. That means she's had practice. That means there have been other dinners." And I did not have anything to say to that, because he was right. He said, "What kind of a person do you have to be married to for 8 years for your wife to get that good at hiding being sick from you?" I said, "Jason, that's not fair." He said, "It's completely fair." I let him sit in it for a minute, because he needed to sit in it. Then I said, "What are you going to do?" And Jason said, "I already did it." He had gone home that night and sat down with Kylie and told her he was sorry. And then he had asked her, and this is the part I think about, he had asked her to teach him what it looks like. Not, "Tell me when you feel bad." Teach me what it looks like. Because he had worked out in the space of about 2 hours, that she was never going to tell him. That telling him was not something Kylie was built to do. That if he wanted to know, he was going to have to learn to read it himself, the way Taylor had read it across a table on the second time she had ever been in that house. He said, "A woman who's met her 9 times noticed, and I didn't." And then he said, "I've got 4 daughters, Mom, 4. And every single one of them is watching how I pay attention to their mother. I sat in my house in Cleveland with the phone against my face. Because there it was again, the same thing, the same mechanism." Somebody asked. Travis asked Kylie. Kylie told Travis. Travis told Jason. Jason asked Kylie something he had not thought to ask in 8 years. One phone call at 11:40 at night, and by the end of the week it had reorganized things in 2 households. That is all it ever takes. I have lived 73 years, and I have never once seen a problem between 2 people who loved each other that survived one of them asking a direct question. Not once. Everything else, the silences, the assumptions, the 10 months of 2 women liking each other and doing nothing about it, the 8 years of a man not knowing what sick looks like on his own wife, all of it exists in the space where nobody asked. Part 9 3/4, February. Finley was born in February of 2025. I am not going to give you details about the birth because they are not mine, and Kylie would end me. What I will tell you is where Taylor was. She was on the other side of the world. There was a thing, a commitment, a professional obligation, something that had been on a calendar for a year and could not be moved. And at some point during a night in February 2025, Kylie Kelce's phone rang in a hospital in Pennsylvania. Kylie told me about it in that same kitchen conversation in June. She said, "It was 2 in the morning my time. I had a 9-hour-old baby on me. I was completely destroyed." She said, "And the phone rings, and it's her." She said, "And I picked up and she said," she didn't say congratulations. She said, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" The same 3 words. The exact same 3 words Travis had said on a phone call at 11:40 at night 3 months earlier. Kylie said, "I started crying so hard I couldn't talk." She said, and she just waited. She didn't fill it. She didn't say, "Oh no," or "It's okay," or any of the things people say to get you to stop. She just stayed on the phone and let me cry. She said, and when I could talk, I said, "Why did you ask me that?" And Taylor said, "Because Travis said it's the only question you'll answer." Kylie Kelce sat in a hospital bed in Pennsylvania in February of 2025 with a newborn on her chest, and understood that at some point in the previous 3 months, her brother-in-law had told his girlfriend, "The one specific thing you have to say to get through to her." She said to me, "He gave her the instructions, Donna." She said, "My idiot brother-in-law gave her the instructions." And then she said, "That's a marriage. That's what a marriage actually is. It's 2 people who tell each other how to love the people they came with." I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything anybody has said to me in the last 5 years. 2 people who tell each other how to love the people they came with. Travis did not just bring Taylor into this family. He briefed her. He gave her the manual. He told her that Jason needs you to be loud with him, and Ed needs you to be quiet with him, and Kylie will not tell you anything unless you ask her a direct question, and my mother will tell you everything if you get her doing dishes. And she read it, and she used it. That is not romance. That is not a grand gesture. That is a man handing somebody the keys to his entire life and saying, "These people are the whole thing. Please learn them." Last Sunday, in that same kitchen in Philadelphia, I watched something. This was after Bennett asked her question. Later in the afternoon, the cake had cooled and been cut, and there were people in and out of that kitchen, the way there are always people in and out of that kitchen. Kylie came in. She looked at the cake on the counter, and she said, without any particular tone, "Is this the good version or your version?" And Taylor said, "Mine." And Kylie said, "So the good version." And Taylor said, "Yes." And Kylie said, "I hate you." And Taylor said, "I know." That was the entire exchange, 11 seconds. Two women in a kitchen with four children screaming somewhere in the house. And I stood by the sink and had to look out the window for a moment. Because if you had shown me that 11 seconds in November of 2024, I would not have believed you. I would not have believed that it was possible for those two specific women, both of them so careful, both of them so committed to not imposing, both of them capable of going a full year in polite paralysis, to get to a place where one of them could say, "I hate you" in a kitchen, and mean it as affection. That is where they got to. It took about 18 months and one phone call from a man who does not know how to be careful. Part 10. The Rehearsal Dinner. July 2nd, 2026. The night before the wedding. There was a dinner. I have described the general shape of it elsewhere, 40-some people, the night before, the kind of gathering that happens when everyone who matters is in one city. Toward the end of the evening, Kylie stood up. She had not been scheduled to speak. I know, because I had seen the schedule. Jason was speaking the next day as best man. Kylie was not on any list. She stood up and she said, "I'm going to be very quick because I don't like this," which got a laugh. And then she said, "Taylor, in November of 2024 you cooked me dinner for 7 hours and I didn't eat any of it." The room went a little quiet. She said, "I'm not going to explain why. Some of you know, most of you don't. It doesn't matter." She said, "What matters is that you cooked a cake from the state I grew up in, because you looked it up, because you couldn't ask anybody, because you were scared I didn't like you." She said, "I want to say something in front of everybody, because I said it once on the phone, and I don't think once was enough." And she looked at Taylor, and she said, "You're not a guest in this family. You never were. I'm sorry it took me a year to figure out how to say that, and I'm sorry that when I finally did it, you had to be sick of me not eating your food to get there." And then she said, "I've made you something. I'm not going to bring it out here, because it's not that kind of thing. It's in the kitchen. Go look at it later." And she sat down, and Jason Kelce put his face in his hands. I saw what it was, later that night. I went into the kitchen with Taylor because she asked me to come with her. It was a cake. The same cake. The Delaware one. Kylie Kelce had made the same cake. Burrs in skim. And it was, I want to be accurate, it was not as good. Kylie will tell you that herself. Kylie has told me that herself, several times, with great irritation. She said Taylor's version was better, and she is not a person who says that kind of thing lightly. There was a card next to it. It said one line. I am going to give you the line because Taylor read it out loud in that kitchen, and there were 3 of us there, and it is not a secret. It said, "Now we're even. Welcome to the family." Taylor Swift stood in a kitchen in New York City at midnight on the night before her wedding and cried over a slightly inferior Delaware cake. And then she cut a piece and ate it standing up. And then she cut a second piece and ate that one too. And Kylie came in about 4 minutes later to see if we had found it, and found Taylor eating the second piece, and said, "Is it bad?" And Taylor, with her mouth full, said, "It's terrible." And Kylie said, "I know." And the 2 of them stood in that kitchen and laughed until Taylor had to sit down. Part 11. The Flower Girls. The next day, 4 little girls walked down an aisle at Madison Square Garden. Wyatt was 6. Elliot was 5. Bennett was 3. Finley was 1 and was carried, which was the correct call. I want to tell you one thing about that, because it connects. At the rehearsal the day before, Wyatt had been given her instructions and had taken them extremely seriously, which is how Wyatt takes everything. And at some point during the rehearsal, she stopped in the middle of the aisle and turned around and asked Taylor a question. She said, "Auntie Tay, are you going to make the cake again?" And Taylor said, Which cake? And Wyatt said, the one from the dinner at our house. 2 years earlier, Wyatt had been 4. She remembered. And Taylor knelt down in the middle of the aisle at Madison Square Garden, in the middle of her own wedding rehearsal, and said, "Yes, I'll make it whenever you want." And Wyatt said, "Okay," and turned back around and kept walking. Travis, standing at the front, watched the whole thing. He told me that night that it was the moment the wedding became real to him. Not the vows, not the rehearsal, not the fittings. A 6-year-old asking about a cake from 2 years ago. He said, "She's already their aunt. That happened somewhere and nobody told me." Part 11 and a half. What Travis said in the vows. There is one line from the vows that I am able to give you, because Travis has repeated it publicly since, and because it belongs to this story. He said, standing at that altar, 40 minutes into 2 people saying everything they had. He said, "You learned my family before you learned me." I was in the 4th row and I watched Kylie Kelce's head come up. He said, "You called my mother about my brother's wife. You looked up a cake from a state you'd never lived in. You called a woman in a hospital at 2 in the morning from the other side of the world and asked her the one question she'd answer." He said, "I've had people love me. I've never had anybody do the homework." And then he said the line. He said, "I fell in love with you at a football stadium. I married you because of a Tuesday in November." A Tuesday in November. Nobody in that room knew what that meant except 6 people. Me, Travis, Taylor, Jason, Kylie, and Wyatt, who was 6, who did not understand any of it, but who leaned over to her mother during the vows and whispered. Kylie told me this later, still furious about how hard it hit her. Wyatt whispered, "Is he talking about the dinner at our house?" And Kylie said, "Yes, Bug." And Wyatt said, "With the cake?" And Kylie said, "With the cake." And Wyatt sat back in her seat, satisfied, having correctly identified the reference in her uncle's wedding vows at 6 years old, and went back to swinging her legs. Part 12. What I think it was about. I want to say what I actually think this story is about, because it is not about a dinner. For a year, Taylor Swift and Kylie Kelce could not figure out how to be friends. And the reason was not dislike, or jealousy, or any of the things that people who write about famous women reach for first. The reason was that both of them were afraid of imposing. Taylor was afraid because she knows exactly what she costs. She knows that a phone call from her is not a phone call. She knows that a visit involves logistics, and a dinner involves a security assessment, and that every ordinary human gesture she makes lands on the other person with a weight she cannot remove. Kylie was afraid because she has spent a decade watching her private life get processed by strangers and has developed one absolute rule, which is, do not become material. Both of them had learned, from being on the wrong end of it, that reaching towards someone can cost that person something. So neither of them reached, and they stayed that way for a year, both of them genuinely fond of each other, both of them completely stuck, until a Tuesday in November, when one of them cooked for 7 hours and the other one was too sick to eat. And it took my son, who has never been subtle about anything in his life, who fixes things by being loud, who has no gift for delicacy whatsoever, to pick up a phone at 11:40 at night and ask a direct question. That is what he brought to it. Not tact, the opposite of tact. Taylor needed somebody who would just ask. She had spent 20 years surrounded by people who managed her, who inferred, who guessed at what she wanted so they would not have to trouble her by asking. And she had gotten so used to it that she had started doing it to herself, building whole explanations for things in the 4 minutes between a plate and a car ride, deciding what she had done wrong before anybody had a chance to say she hadn't. And then a very large man from Ohio pulled a car over on the side of a road in Philadelphia and said, "You don't get to decide what it meant by yourself. There's somebody in the car now. That is what he is for." That is, I think, the actual answer to the question everybody has been asking since September of 2023. What does Taylor Swift see in Travis Kelce? He asks. That is it. That is the whole thing. Everybody around her infers, and he asks. She has spent her entire adult life among people fluent in a language of hints and management and careful non-imposition. And she married a man who calls his brother's pregnant wife at 11:40 at night and says, "Are you okay?" Part 13. The thing I got wrong. I have to include this because I have been honest all the way through and I am not going to get soft at the end. I did nothing that night. I sat across from Kylie Kelce for 2 hours and 20 minutes. I noticed at minute 12. I confirmed at minute 25. I watched her go gray. I counted her breaths. And I did not say one word. I want to explain why, because the why is not flattering, and I think it might be useful to somebody. I did not say anything because I did not want to be wrong in public. That is it. That is the whole reason. If I had leaned over and said, "Kylie, are you all right?" and she had said, "I'm fine," which she would have, because she is Kylie, then I would have been the woman who made a thing out of nothing at a dinner party. I would have drawn attention to a plate. I would have made Taylor look at it, if she had not already been looking at it. So I stayed quiet and told myself that staying quiet was the tactful choice. It was not tactful. It was cowardly. There is a difference, and I know exactly what it is, and I chose wrong. 4 days. 4 days that woman was sick, and 4 days Taylor thought she had ruined something, and I could have ended it at minute 25 with 6 words. I have thought about this for 2 years. And here is what I have concluded, and it is the most useful thing I have to say to anybody listening. The tactful thing and the kind thing are not the same thing, and they are almost never the same thing, and when you cannot tell which one you are probably doing the tactful one. Tact protects you. Kindness costs you something. If it is not costing you anything, if it is comfortable, if it lets you stay seated, if it means you do not have to risk being told you were wrong, it is not kindness. It is manners. I have very good manners. I was raised by women with very good manners. I have spent 73 years with excellent manners. And on a Tuesday in November 2024, my excellent manners kept me in a chair for 2 hours, while 2 people I love were both suffering in ways I could have ended with a question. My son, who has no manners at all, picked up a phone at 11:40 at night and fixed it in 6 minutes. I would like that on the record. Final. Last Sunday. So let me go back to where I started. Last Sunday, August 2026. A kitchen in Philadelphia. A 4-year-old with her hands behind her back asking why Auntie Tay always makes this one. Here is the rest of that afternoon. After I failed to answer Bennett, and after the 11-second exchange between Kylie and Taylor that I have already told you about, we sat down and ate it. All of us. Kylie, Taylor, me, 4 children, and Jason, who came in at the end and had thirds, because Jason is who he is and some things do not change, and thank God for that. Wyatt got the first piece. Nobody decided that. Nobody has ever decided it. It happened once, and then it happened again, and now it is simply how it goes, which is how every real family tradition in the history of the world has ever started. And at some point during that, with everybody eating and the noise level where it should be, Taylor looked across the table at Kylie. And she said, "I still can't believe you cleaned your house for 4 hours." And Kylie said, "I still can't believe you looked up Delaware." And they both laughed. And Bennett, who was listening the way 4-year-olds listen, which is to say completely and without anybody realizing it, said, "What's Delaware?" And Kylie said, "It's where I'm from, Bug." And Bennett said, "Is that why the cake?" And there was a small silence at that table. And Taylor Swift said, "Yeah, Bennett, that's why the cake." And Bennett said, "Oh," and went back to eating, and the conversation moved on, and nobody made anything of it. But I want you to understand what just happened there. because I understood it about 4 seconds later and had to put my fork down. A 4-year-old just got the answer. The whole thing, the entire 2 years, compressed into 6 words at a kitchen table on an ordinary Sunday in August, in a form that a child can hold. That's why the cake. That is how it gets passed down. Not through a story like this one. Through 6 words at a table, over and over, until one day Bennett is 30 and somebody asks her about her aunt, and she says, "She made a cake from my mom's home state before she even knew if my mom liked her." And whoever is listening will say, "Why?" And Bennett will say, "Because that's who she is." She will not know about the phone call at 11:40 at night. She will not know about the 4 days, or the hyperemesis, or the week the internet spent calling her mother cold, or her grandmother sitting at a table for 2 hours and 20 minutes doing nothing. She will just know the cake. And honestly, that is probably the right amount. One last thing about last Sunday. When Taylor was leaving, she hugged me at the door the way she does now, which is properly, with both arms, for longer than most people hug. And she said, "Thank you for having me." And I said, "Taylor, it's Kylie's house." And she said, "I know. I meant in general." And then she got in the car and went to wherever she was going next. And I stood in that doorway in Philadelphia and thought about a woman in a kitchen in November of 2024 with flour on her forearm and a printout with handwriting in the margins, asking me whether her boyfriend's brother's wife liked her. 2 years. That is how long it took to get from that question to "thank you for having me." In general, 2 years is not very long. It only feels long when you are in it. Because there is a version of this family where that dinner in November of 2024 was the beginning of something cold, where Taylor decided she had overstepped and never tried again, where Kylie decided she had been rude and overcorrected into politeness, which is the death of any relationship between two private people. That version was available. It was right there. It was honestly the more likely one. It did not happen because a man made a phone call. That is all. That is the whole mechanism. Somebody was willing to ask an awkward question at 11:40 at night rather than let two people he loved stay wrong about each other. If there is anything in this story worth taking home, that is it. Ask. Do not infer, do not guess, do not build a whole story out of a plate. Ask. I'm Donna Kelce, Taylor Swift's mother-in-law. And I sat across a table from my daughter-in-law for 2 hours and 20 minutes and could not tell what was happening, and I have been quiet about it for 2 years, and I am not quiet about it anymore. Nobody was rude that night. Everybody was just careful. Careful is not the same as kind, and it took my loud, unsubtle, impossible son to teach that to two of the most thoughtful women I have ever known.